Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm bringing this podcast to you from Ozark, Missouri today. We are on Route 66, me and my travelling companions Mike and Mick. We started this journey a few days ago in Chicago, as you do when you do Route 66, and we jumped in our big GMC Arcadia SUV four-wheel drive thing that's parked over there in front of the room. And this is our third place that we've stayed at. This is the Best Western Hotel in Ozark. Apparently Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, stayed here in 1950 squish. So if it's good enough for the king, it's good enough for me. And yeah, it's right near the road. You can probably hear the traffic and the rumblings of V8s and things. And yeah, we're having a ball. If I look tired, it's because it's about 107 degrees. And I'm not used to this kind of heat, but I'm enjoying it. It's all good. You can sort of see the nostalgic cars and bits and pieces behind me, and it's all very American, you know, as you'd kind of expect, really. So I wanted to bring you a podcast, despite the fact that's what I'm talking about. I wanted to bring you a podcast, despite the fact that I'm not in the UK. So through the magic of television, here's one I made earlier, and in the words of Keith Lemon, back to the studio. Hello, welcome to podcast episode 4. This podcast is now available on iTunes. Just search in the iTunes store for Sound Advice or for John W. Doyle and keep your eye open for my mug on the little logo, and you'll find it pretty easily. This week's podcast is about one thing, which is something I call melodic techniques. Melodic techniques isn't the right word for these things, but it sums up a group of techniques that I use within scales to make things sound nice, and that every guitar player that I've ever seen who plays lead guitar does as well. But it's just nice to have them all in one place. And with us doing scales a couple of weeks ago and a little bit of soloing, I thought it made sense to show you some of the things that were the mechanics behind some of the things that I was doing in those solos. So there's only going to be a few things in this week's podcast, but gaining control of these techniques and really getting good at them is super important, which is why I want to devote a whole podcast to it. So if I was to play through, for example, the minor pentatonic scale that we did last week, 2 weeks ago. So again, I'm keeping my hand flat, I've got a decent enough technique, I'm alternate picking, trying to keep things quite tidy. So the first one of the melodic techniques I want to get into is slides. Now, when you slide into a note, all that you're doing is you're moving from a note further down the neck. So for example, if I was playing this A note here, I might slide into it from this G. That sounds all right. You always want to try and slide into position so that you're then ready to play some other stuff. So I slid the A note. And the only exception to that might be if you finish a phrase and you want to slide off and then kill the strings with your palm to make it sound a bit more professional. Lots of guitar players do that. So we might slide in to start, slide off again at the end. You can slide between positions. There was an octave run that I did on an earlier podcast, and you could slide through some of that potentially. Get some of that going on. Where you slide from is not that important. You're not hearing the note from where you're sliding from very clearly. So you can slide from a couple of frets before, or from 5 frets before, and it'll still sound pretty cool. If you want more of a jazzy sound, you can slide it in from 1 fret before. That gives a little bit of a jazzy kind of tone to it, I personally find. And the longer ones are a bit more rock. You know, you get a bit of that going on. So that's the first thing, is slides. Just getting used to sliding along the string and position. You're keeping the pressure on the string, but you shouldn't be strangling the string while you're doing it, and you're picking and then sliding into the next position, and that's slides. The next couple of melodic techniques that I want to look at are all about moving the strings. The coolest thing that you can do on the guitar that you can't really do on any other instrument that doesn't have frets anyway, is you can bend the strings. So you can play a string and then you can push it up the fret. So you've bent the tension, you've added tension to the string, and you've raised the pitch of the note. And that's called a bend. Now, how far you bend the note's pitch depends on what kind of bend it is. I just did a full bend because I bent that basically a full tone or 2 frets. So I bent it from this note here to this note here. I'll play that again. And you'll get used to the tension that your fingers require to do these different bends. Now, when we're playing within that scale, I always recommend using the finger which will play the note in the scale naturally. So for example, on the G string there, I was using my third finger, whereas on the B string I might use my little finger. I'm doing a full bend again. Same on the E string. There's always a little bit of debate as to which way you should bend the strings. The way that I look at it is you bend the string in the direction where there's most guitar. So if you're on this note, you don't want to bend it this way, you're going to fall off. That's not going to work out. If you're on the B string, same again, you're going to fall off. So if you're on the G or the D, if you wanted to, you could bend it down using your third finger to pull the string like that. Either one of those techniques is absolutely fine. And again, the technique that I'm using now, I'm keeping my hand reasonably still when I'm pushing up, and I'm extending my fingers and just tensing the hand a little bit to give a little bit of that kind of spring to the strings, okay? So that's bends. There's a half bend and a full bend. The half bend would be 1 fret, and the full bend would be 2 frets. Now when you've done this for a little bit longer, you can start getting a little bit more advanced with how you think about bending up to those notes. For example, just bending up to that note in a straight line sounds okay. But you might decide to take your time with the bend and drag it out a little bit. That gives you a bit more of a specific sound. Or you might go country and bend it very quickly. So that's, you know, there's different aspects to the bend that you can consider later on. I'll probably do another podcast looking more deep into that in the future, but for now, just getting used to the idea of doing the bends, using the right fingers, and you know, just getting some of that going on is where to start with it, I think. The next technique is, I think, the most important on the guitar, which is vibrato. Vibrato is where you move the string like a bend, but you keep the string moving. So for example, I can play this A note here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend it slightly off pitch and then let it back to pitch again, and I'm going to repeat that over and over so it wobbles. Now if you do this too much, it can sound a little bit much. If you do it more than that, it just sounds like you're bending it out of tune a little bit. If you don't do it enough, nothing really happens. On electric guitar, moving your hand this way doesn't really do a lot. Works great on a classical guitar, but doesn't really do very much on electric. So try and avoid doing that if possible. Unless you've no option, you're doing it with a chord and you want to get a little bit of something moving about. Now again, there's a couple of tips that I recommend when you're doing vibrato. The first one is, don't vibrato straight away, maybe just leave a little bit of time for the note to establish. So if I land on a note, I'll leave it and then I'll start vibratoing. I'll just leave a little space so you can hear what it is. Otherwise you get this. And it just sounds a little bit less in tune because you landed on a moving note then and it kind of sounds a little bit odd. So I like to sort of get that going on. And the vibrato is exactly the same technique as the bends in the mechanics of your hand. If you're on the lower strings, you're going to be pushing those notes up. So that same kind of push with the little finger side of your hand that you're doing on the bends. And if I'm on the lower strings, I can be pulling the vibrato this way. You have to on the very lowest string, otherwise you'll fall off. Same as before, really. You can think about with the vibrato how fast and slow you go. You don't have to just do it the same way. Sometimes a nice slow is quite pleasant. Sometimes something faster gives a little bit of a different sound. So you can choose the sound that you want with the vibrato. But vibrato is, I think, far and away the most important of these melodic techniques. And then the other ones is the idea of hammers and pulls and using hammers and pulls as melodic techniques, which is just basically, like before we had the slide into the note, you might sort of start with this A but slide in, something like that. Well, with hammers and pulls you could hammer onto that note. So you're just hinting at that first note and then doing a hammer onto the next one. And same works with pulls. You hear that quite a lot in blues, where you just pull off that note and get the A, and it sounds quite nice. You'll notice that almost automatically I stick vibrato on the end of these things to make it sound a little bit nicer. That's just, when I'm soloing, I use a lot of vibrato, I use a lot of hammers and pulls, slides and bends. So if you were watching the video, the podcast from a couple of podcasts ago where I was doing a little bit of soloing around with the notes, and you were thinking, I wonder what all that was. All the stuff that was making it sound cool was this. was these melodic techniques. These are the things that make the stuff that you play really come alive as a guitarist. And if you don't use these, if you don't put these into your playing, then your playing will kind of suffer, to be honest with you, because all of the great guitar players all do this kind of stuff, and it sounds fantastic, which is the main thing with it. So so yeah, just going back over those again, we have the slides. Don't worry about where you slide from, but just make sure that you slide into position so that you can play, unless it's at the end and you want to slide off and kill what you're doing and finish. We then had the bends, and the idea of the bends were that we had a full bend, which is 2 frets, so we're bending from this note to this note, or we had a half bend, which is 1 fret, and again, you can choose whether you go slowly up to the note or fast. So that was the bends. We had vibrato, and vibrato is where you play the note, just leave it a second, and then start wobbling it. And you can choose how fast you wobble, how far you wobble, and you've got control over those parameters. Then we had hammers and pulls at the end, where you just drop a little hammer in, and you get those kind of things going on. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's kind of shone a little bit of light on some of those things. There's loads of other things that you can do to the notes. There's loads of other little techniques that you can use, but these are the big ones. These are the ones that you're going to use more than any others, that are really going to influence the way that your playing sounds. So yeah, they're the ones that you want to get into. Listen to your favorite guitar player, listen to your favorite guitar solo, see how many of those different things you can pull out. See if you can hear if there's vibrato or bends or hammers and pulls or slides, and you'll start recognizing that you might have 3 or 4 guitar players that you like, and they might kind of have a lot of the same things going on in their playing that you can spot and pick out, and then you can be practicing the thing that will take you closer to playing like the guy you want to play like. So that pretty much wraps it up for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the melodic techniques lesson. I use those all the time. I suggest that you do. From last week's podcast, or the week before, there were some backing tracks. If you just scroll down the podcast page, you'll see them, little MP3s. Download those and then practice these over those, and try and make it all, backing tracks are more interesting to play along with than a metronome. Use the 4 scales from that same lesson as well, and that'll do the job. All right, so this podcast is over. So this podcast is over. I will see you next week.